Welcome to our course on programming standalone devices in Integration Designer. Now, in most RTI systems, the processor is going to handle all the control. That's exactly how we want it. But sometimes you'll encounter a device where traditional control just isn't practical. That's where standalone programming comes in. It's not a replacement for a processor-based control, but just another tool you can use to bridge the gap when you absolutely need to. In this webinar, we'll cover how standalone devices work, when to use it, and what some of the trade-offs are when programming. Before we begin, let's start with the controllers that support standalone, our Intelligent Surface Remote 2 and 4, and our T1B Plus. There are legacy controllers that also support standalone, but they have been discontinued. Now, if you're using an iOS or Android phone or tablet, or a touchscreen, or even our U3 waterproof remote, you're not going to be able to use standalone. So make sure if you're co-mingling devices that use standalone or can do standalone with devices that can't do standalone, that you make the necessary provisions with your client. Now, there's different standalone applications, one of which is a pure standalone system. Now, of course, I don't recommend doing that. The remotes are based on trigger control, which talks to a processor, and you're going to wind up giving up some of the features with a very expensive remote that's not going to have even some of the features that it usually does. So talking directly to devices like televisions, subwoofers, cable boxes, and any kind of media player would be an example of a standalone system. Now, more common and perfectly okay, there are times when you're not going to be able to get a device wired properly. Either there's going to be masonry or brickwork or some kind of millwork done. You're not going to be able to get an emitter to it or an Ethernet cable, and there's no driver available or something like that. You're going to have to use standalone. And standalone doesn't mean that you're controlling the device and all devices over standalone. You're controlling some devices using a typical trigger if you're using the ISR remotes, a Wi-Fi trigger if you're using a T1B Plus or a U3. There are one-way triggers and two-way Zigbee triggers. So that's a way you can control the devices you need to with standalone, but still control the rest of your devices with the control processor triggers. Now, what are some of these trade-offs with using standalone? And there are several. So some of the trade-offs are going to be the reliability of control. Obviously, if you send a trigger code, you're sending one trigger code, and since all the macros are at the processor level, you're going to give up that way of controlling devices. Now you're going to have to send one device, one signal at a time, which we all know people walk in front of it, or if you don't aim the remote properly. And our remotes spray IR pretty well, but it's not a great way of controlling devices. Another trade-off is the fact that System Manager now kind of gets disqualified, at least for the device you're using. And if it's a focal device like a television or EVR, well, you're giving up a lot of that built-in intelligence. You can still use System Manager, but with a caveat. You might not have all the features available and all the tracking available, and certainly not all the data points that are updated based on whether devices are on or off. So use that with a grain of salt. System Manager will be compromised to some extent, to a larger extent or not. If you're using a subwoofer or something like that, you could still use System Manager perfectly. And we'll go over different scenarios. Now, two-way control and feedback, that's another big caveat. Now, you're using infrared in the first place, so you're not really concerned too much about two-way control and feedback. But having two-way control is also a way of using those necessary triggers and stuff like that. So you're going to give up that means of control, the driver advantages, driver events, some of the macro steps you would be normally accustomed to with using a device that is off the processor will now be disqualified. In fact, not all macro steps will show up, and a lot more macro steps will be available that are only available in standalone. Again, there's different cases with standalone. You can do hybrid macros or all macros, and we're going to go over those next. And speaking of that, let's go over some of the programming now. Now, in Integration Designer, you're going to have situations where you want to do a complete standalone system. I'll show you how to do that and how those work. So we'll create a new project. Let's create a new system file, and we'll call this standalone project. And so instead of adding a processor like we normally do, we're going to select standalone. Now, your system will give up a lot of features, including System Manager. You'll have to fire macros directly out of the remote. And of course, System Manager, which lives on the processor, will be compromised. You won't be able to use it to any extent. Okay? So we'll add that standalone processor name and add that to the system. Now you'll have a complete standalone system. You can still add the rooms you want. So we'll just throw in a media room here. With controllers, you're going to have to select controllers that are capable of standalone. Again, you're going to find a lot of our legacy controllers are capable of standalone. Our ISRs, T1B Plus are capable of standalone. So we'll throw in an ISR2. Let's look for our intelligent surface remotes. We'll throw the 2.8-inch into the media room. And now when it comes to System Manager, you're not going to be able to use list menus. That is a byproduct of a control processor. So even though the choice is there, you're not going to be able to use list menus. So we'll select either button menus, but we're not going to be able to even use the template typically like we normally do because we don't have a control processor. So even though I'll select button menus and name the controller, I'm going to leave the page creations off for now, or I'll just leave them and we can see what happens. I'll probably wind up doing another template like Obsidian, which doesn't have the built-in System Manager functions that you're accustomed to. Those include the button menus, the navigation for your menus, the pop-ups, and things like that. So we can create a page, but we'll use an older template that won't build any System Manager framework. Let's add that device. Now, if you're using your own templates, that won't be a problem. You just won't be able to use the System Manager elements, which include the navigation for menu systems. Okay? All right. So now that we've added our standalone processor, well, no processor. We basically said we don't need a processor. We're communicating in standalone. We added our remote. Now we'll go over to the infrared tab and add our devices. So we'll add a TV, throw in a Samsung TV, most models. Click next. Now where it says output port, there is no output ports because we don't have a processor. So all of our devices are operating in standalone. So we'll name this TV media room, and we can create pages if we like. And we'll throw in another device like a cable box. I'll throw in an Xfinity cable box. Now remember, you're going to have to point the remote, or you're going to have those devices available outside in the open area so that infrared commands can get to them naturally. So we'll add a cable box. Standalone again. We'll call this cable media room. And we'll create our control page, which will be all standalone commands. All right, I think you get the idea. Let's click Add Device. And now let's close out and take a look. Now, if I open up my workspace, we've got no processor, instead standalone. Okay, we've got our ISR2 in standalone. So in the properties here, we can do things like, set power downtime and things like that. We can still communicate with the remote over Wi-Fi to sync it, and the remote can still be able to sync over the Wi-Fi connection, but we're not going to be able to send out driver commands or any kind of triggers. Okay. So we'll set this power down time to 50 seconds and we'll jump out. Now, if you look at a typical control page, like our cable box, did I add a page? Let's go to the page wizard here. Looks like it didn't add any pages naturally. Let's go and add some for us. It looks like there's no Obsidian template in the latest version. So let's add some Coral pages. I'll go look for a cable satellite box, insert that, and I'll go to my TV and do the same thing. Page wizard, cable satellite or TV, insert, and close. Now, if you look at a cable box, for example, you're going to have the commands and the macro levels that you would expect, source level macros, so that if you make a change and you have got multiple standalone controllers, you'll be able to adjust the command properly. So your commands will be programmed as they would normally. And under sources, your commands will be shown. So you have a complete standalone system where you can communicate as you would normally do without a processor. Again, if you're doing something like this, I recommend our Pro Control remotes. Those are going to be a little bit more economical. And if you're sending out commands only, you're going to have hard buttons and things like that because you won't really be able to take advantage too much of a lot of elements on the touchscreen. Okay? Especially feedback. All right, so that's a standalone system. Again, you're going to go without a lot of the intelligence, the reliability, the built-in navigation, and all those kinds of things. But if your client just wants a remote control, you can still do it with RTI. So if you're using a T1B Plus, that would be more economical. But again, I do recommend Pro Control for an application like this, although possible with RTI. You could still take advantage of viewports. You could do camera surveillance feeds because those run on the remote. So you still have those capabilities here. You've got your viewports since those are built into the remote. Again, you can scroll through different viewports, just not any processor communication. All right, so let's X out of that. And now let's open up a file that we already created with some devices that are just talking to a processor, and I'll go over it. Simple file, XB6S. We've got a Kaleidoscape player. We've got a Bijou. We got a Bijou audio device, and we've got a Blu-ray player. So those devices are added the normal way. Those are all going to communicate with the control processor. Okay? Now, let's say you've got a TV or a subwoofer. Let's take both. Let's say a TV and a subwoofer where you're just not going to be able to get an emitter to them, right? You can control those devices. Now, it's up to you if you want to use the efficiency of System Manager, but you won't be able to program your TV commands in there or your subwoofer. You're going to have to program them outside of System Manager. And you're going to give up the ability to track a lot of that information and to use a lot of that information the way you normally would with System Manager. So let's add a TV in standalone the same way. We're going to go to infrared. We're going to search for a TV. Let's look for a Samsung TV again. Okay. We're going to go with the most models. You're going to have to go to the infrared tab. You're not going to, and even though you can use drivers in your project, if you're using a standalone device, infrared is the only one possible. Okay. Or you could add a page set and then just add infrared standalone commands to that. But we're going to use an infrared set. Samsung TV almost models, add it to the bar. And now instead of routing out of all ports or a specific port, we're going to set this device to standalone. Okay. And we'll name this Samsung TV bar. Now, when it comes to creating pages, that's up to you. And you certainly can do that if you want. You'll get the same pages we showed you with the previous exercise of the all standalone system. Okay. So we'll add that device now to the system. Now let's add another device, a subwoofer. Let's look for a subwoofer. I'll look for a Velodyne sub. Let's find one. Here's a simple one. Let's find something with a few more commands. Okay, let's go with this one. Let's see if there's any discrete power. Yes, there is. So we'll add that too. Again, instead of routing a port, standalone. Okay, you'll have the option in the routing. Okay, and we'll call this subwoofer bar. And if you want to create a page, that's up to you. I don't think Integration Designer will create a page here, but we'll go ahead and add it anyway. All right, once you're done, click close. Now, with your system, there are two ways to deal with this. Now, when you look at your regular homepage here, you'll have a pop-up of sources, right? And so we'll go and configure one of these sources. Let's make this our kaleidoscape activity, and we'll name this Watch Kaleidoscape. And we'll put our icon on here. Search for a kaleidoscape icon. We'll throw one of those icons on. So now that we have this, if we want to use System Manager or not, we're going to go to the tag browser and drag and drop our activity tag over. Now, if you drag this over, it will program a tag and an underlying macro to tell System Manager to select the activity that you need to program for the kaleidoscape. So let's, for the first exercise, assume that you're going to use System Manager. Okay? So you're going to go to System Manager in the bar area. And for the kaleidoscape and our other activities, you're going to have to program these as you normally would. For activity start, well, I'll go and put a please wait page in there. That's what they're normally used for. So I'm going to go bring in a page link, and I'll jump to a please wait page if you have one. We don't have one in here, so we'll forego it. For room on, well, this is where I'm going to turn on my bijou. Again, that's using regular system macros, and hence the name system here in this grayed out drop-down menu. You have to understand that you're sending commands first to the processor, a trigger, and then the processor will communicate with your device. So let's bring in our command for our bijou player, and we'll turn that on, and we'll do a little brief delay. Nothing crazy, just 1 second, okay? And then now when it comes to video on, got a problem here because this can only run in system mode. So we're not going to be able to turn on the TV within System Manager or activate the subwoofer, okay? So there's a couple of options we can do here. Now, if you do bring in a command, I want you to notice that your TV and sub just aren't available in system mode, nor should they be, meaning you cannot send a system macro from the remote to the processor to communicate with those devices. You're going to have to send a command to communicate with those devices directly, okay? So those devices aren't even going to show up here or in your source list. The TV and subwoofer are not here, okay? So we're not going to be able to program this anyway, okay? Now for the power on source, this is where we'll turn on our kaleidoscape. And not that this is a lesson in System Manager, but activity selected will switch inputs. So again, we're not going to be able to switch the input on our TV. Okay, so if we're going to set our bijou to eARC, but again, we're not going to set our TV to HDMI 1. We're not going to be able to do that. Now, it's probably best that you use a device like a bijou or AVR that does the switching for you, so you don't have to worry about setting up the input in the system macro command, because then you're going to have to program flags to track it. You're not going to have the reliability or the intelligence of system variable tests. And we'll get to that. Activity ready is programmed. And again, with room off start, again, please wait, deselected, we don't need. Power off source, we'll turn off the kaleidoscape. So let's just add that in real quick, just to make this work correctly. And video off, we can't program. We can turn off the bijou, but again, the TV and sub are completely discounted from System Manager. Now, System Manager will think it ran, okay, but it won't really run anything within System Manager. So you'll still be able to use the intelligence to a certain extent, but it's going to get real dicey when you start trying to track whether or not that device is on or not. It's simply not going to do that for you. And even though it thinks it's doing that, well, you're going to have to really program it outside System Manager. So once you're done here, what do you do now? Well, you've got to go to your original macro here, and you're going to have to program this with commands that are outside of this command here to run the activity. So what you can do is delete this command. We're going to delete it, okay? And now we're going to go to the controller level macro. Now watch, we're in system mode, but this drop-down now can be accessible and can be changed to a different access level in standalone, okay? But we don't want to just run standalone commands. We want to run half of the commands that turn on the TV and sub in standalone, but the rest of the commands we want to run in system mode. So here's what we do. We can now select standalone. Now watch what happens to my sources here when I toggle this to standalone. Now only your sources that have the ability to communicate in standalone are going to display. So here we're going to go and we're going to select our power on to our television. So scroll down to the P's, power on, okay? Maybe you want to turn on your sub as well. So you're going to have to do that also. Let's turn on our sub. So we'll look for our power on here. And now our sub is on. But now, what about the other macros? Well, now you could bring in the select activity for the bar and pick the kaleidoscope. And that will run this System Manager after turning on these two devices in standalone. Do I love doing this? Do I recommend this? No, because of the trade-offs, but perfectly doable if you want, okay? And always put the standalone commands first. Do not put the activity first, because this might fire quite a bit of activities and might never run these. It might overrun or clobber these. So always put that select activity, which is going to send batch commands last. Okay? There are ways around that with call macros, but I don't recommend doing that if you're using System Manager. Okay? So select activity. And now what about when you turn off this system? Okay? Well, of course, with the power off system, you're going to use the System Manager here to turn off the current room. And that you can do. Let's cut this command. And now I'm going to go to my controller level, which is the only macro level that you can toggle from system to standalone. And now, of course, I'm going to go to my Samsung commands, hit the letter P on my keyboard, which will take you down to your P commands. And let's set that to power off. And then we'll go to our sub commands and turn that off. And of course, we'll paste in our room off current room, which will be the bar on this local controller. Okay? So now it'll run those two commands, turn those off quickly, and then it will run the routines, the deselection events in System Manager that you've programmed, turning off all those devices in system mode. Okay? Now, what if you wanted to bypass System Manager? You're doing a commercial application, and now you have to bypass System Manager because there are some things you want to do outside of the System Manager's sandbox, right? System Manager is one room at a time control. Maybe you want to turn on all your televisions first, and you need standalone, or you just want to do something outside of System Manager. Perfectly acceptable, Okay, we recommend using System Manager, but it's not the end all be all. Okay, so we're going to go back to our room selection again, to our source selection, excuse me. Okay, and then we're going to put another activity on here. What else do we have in system mode? We've got a Blu-ray. So I'm going to label this text, watch Blu-ray, and I'm going to program this outside of System Manager. Watch Blu-ray. I'm going to bring in my icons for Blu-ray. Let's look for something that makes sense. I'll bring in that command right there. That looks good. And now, again, I'm going to drag my tag over. Do you have to drag the tag over? We highly recommend it. It keeps things consistent, right? It's going to make sure that you even have a tag for you instead of typing in your own tags. Now, if you've got other controllers, you drag and drop those tags as well, and they'll inherit the commands, even if they're standalone, okay? All right, so now we're going to go and drag the tag over for the Blu-ray. But what's it going to do? It's going to populate a command in here to run a System Manager routine. We don't want that. We don't want to run System Manager in this kind of a system. So we'll delete that command, okay? Now, when you're doing a command that's a macro that's half on the processor or part on the processor and part standalone, the first thing you're going to do is program a room level macro with the system commands. Notice that global, source, and room cannot be toggled to standalone. These are hard-coded system commands. So on a room level, that way, if you've got other controllers doing the same thing, you don't have to program them again, okay? We're going to program our routine here. We're going to go to our macro steps, and I'd rather bring in a command here to first turn on our Bijou in system mode, of course, on. Let's do a little bit of a delay, nothing crazy, and then send the command to turn on our Blu-ray player, which is also a standalone device. We'll power on our Blu-ray, and we'll switch inputs on our Bijou. Since that's a driver, well, that'll be a pretty quick set input. We don't even need this delay. We could run these in succession without any kind of problem, okay? So there we go. System mode commands, half on the processor. But how do you run standalone commands? Well, you're going to go to the controller level macro, the only macro level that requires you to be able, well, not requires you, but allows you to select between system mode and standalone mode. Now, again, don't have access to that TV and sub, but as soon as I change this to standalone, there they are. And now I could bring in a command here, turn on my TV, scroll down to the power on command, and I'll bring in another command. Notice again, I only have access in standalone to standalone devices, my subwoofer, and turn that guy on, okay? And I could do necessary routines like check to see if a flag is set to send a delay to switch inputs on my TV. If I want, I could throw a TV input command in. And if you want to make sure that this runs properly, you might want to use a flag, although this will be rerunnable. Now, I've got a room macro with the system commands. I've got a controller macro with the standalone commands. How do I join those together? Well, on the controller level macro now, you're going to bring in a call macro command. So call macro, bring that in. And now with the call macro, what room is your macro you want to call in? Well, it's in our bar. The source in the bar? No, it's a room macro. So I'm going to bypass the middle menu, which is meant for sources only. So I could run a particular command off of a source. But since I'm running a room macro, I'm going to leave this set to room macro and no source selected. And now my activity tag will show up here. So these commands will run in standalone, and from the same button, it will call the macro, the room macro, with the system commands to run on the button that's in the command that's in standalone. So it'll run half of this in standalone mode. And when it calls the macro, which is in system mode, it'll run through these in system mode. And now your client will have the ability to have the activity set up properly and be able to use it as he wants. Okay. Now, if you look at some of the interfaces, you're going to have all the functionality you need on your TV. Let's say to edit the page tile and changes to TV. Okay. But you're not going to have the benefit of the system manager. These are all in standalone commands. Even your subwoofer, which really doesn't have a page, we could add a blank page for that called sub, and we could bring in our own background. Well, instead, we could use the page wizard. Let's just bring in a blank one. We'll name this sub. And we could call this the name of the title, subwoofer. And now we can go and put in some buttons that are programmed with with any buttons you would normally do. You're not going to get reverse state. You will when you press it, but you won't be able to force buttons to reverse state. So let's say this was a phase control. You could still take advantage of the tag browser. So let's add a bunch of buttons here. I don't know if this sub's going to have tags. No, it won't, but you could still bring in your macro steps here. Go to the sub. We'll name this first button preset 1. And it will auto program preset 1. We'll name this preset 2 and preset 3. And we'll line these, of course, and center them and name them properly. That's the typical standalone commands. You could either run you could run a complete standalone system, or you could run a partial system with System Manager, mostly in system mode, but some devices in standalone. Or you can bypass System Manager and run commands here, like you see here, partially in System Manager here, where it's turning on the TV and the subwoofer outside of System Manager before calling the selection events in System Manager, or you can run it completely outside System Manager. You'll create a room macro in system mode, a controller macro in standalone mode, which will run the standalone commands and call the macro on the room level in system mode. So it will fire those commands off the processor. Again, standalone is one of those last resort things, right? We always want to be able to control devices without having to do line of sight from a remote. And we all know that devices out there are not all capable of standalone. iOS and Android phone or tablets, you're not going to get standalone. IST10 keypads, standalone is not going to happen. So we need to use it with compatible remotes and as a last resort. Let's go to the Q&A window. If anyone has any questions, just type them in the Q&A window. That's the little question mark called Q&A. Happy to answer any questions. Straightforward, how to program standalone commands. One more little thing I want to show you. When you're in standalone, right? Let's say in standalone mode, your macro steps are going to shrink a little bit, and you're going to have a couple of extra things that you can do here. Well, I think one thing you can do here differently. There's going to be a button test that you normally don't have available in system mode. And in the button test, what it is, let's say I bring a button test in here. I'll put it to the top. I could either do an if else based on if the button is held down for X amount of seconds, or double click before a certain amount of time. So let's say you want this button, if its button's held down for 2 seconds, if the button's held down for 2 seconds, it will run this activity. and then jump finally to the page that it needs to. Now, notice in standalone that you're only going to be able to use static remotes in standalone, which is okay because in control level macros, they're exclusive to the controller. So now I can select a particular page jump, like my Blu-ray. I could even select a page that I can jump to. You won't be able to do that in system mode. So I could jump to page 1, 2, 3, or whatever page I want if there are multiple pages. Okay, so that's something you could do in standalone also. Now, what you want to do if the button is not held down for 2 seconds is simply just page link to the device. So again, if you hold down the button for 2 seconds, it'll run the activity. Or if you just press the button, it'll just jump to the activity. So now you don't have to worry about firing the activity again. In standalone, that's sometimes things you want to do, or even in system mode, that's something you can do as long as you set your macro to standalone, okay? You could also do if a button is double-clicked before 2 seconds. So you've got 2 seconds to double-click it. I'd probably recommend 1.5 or less. But if a button is double-clicked before a second passes, fire the activity. Else, if it's just pressed normally, then just jump to the activity. So those are things you could do to have a button work on 2 things. One more thing, because I keep realizing other things, flags. What if you're in standalone and you want to use flags? Well, there's 256 macro flags that are on the processor, XP macro flags, but there are also 256 local flags. So now if I select a local flag, and I could name them in standalone, it'll say edit local controller flag names. Now I could call this ISD10 Blu-ray activity. And I could set that activity when that button is pressed, or anything I want. I could set clear the local flag. Okay, so you can use local flags. You could do an if flag is set based on local flags, but only if you're in standalone. Okay, so there are special functionality that you'll get in standalone. Okay, and that's our course. Pretty quick, pretty straightforward. Again, if you have any questions, you could either type them in the Q&A window, or you could give us a call or email. Happy to answer any questions at any time. So that was a standalone, programming in standalone. Again, you're going to have some trade-offs with standalone, but it is possible with RTI. You could also do it in Pro Control, and you need to use standalone devices. Thanks so much for joining us. That was a quick webinar. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.